demonstrates how a hero should correctly save someone falling from a great height when he catches Snotlout. And thus we have this really interesting situation where we have an unrealistic and a realistic example of this trope right next to each other in the same episode. And we are thus forced to the conclusion that Hookfang is a better physicist than either Hiccup or Toothless. Berk is a strange place indeed. So, continuing our educational portion of this podcast, assuming you haven't shut it off already, the word of the day is cobbler, C-O-B-B-L-E-R, which has a few different meanings, two of which could be relevant to this episode. Now, one meaning that isn't relevant and might be the first thing you think of is, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a sort of pie baked in a pot lined with dough of great thickness upon which fruit is placed. According to the fruit, it is an apple or peach cobbler. So, I like peach cobbler. That is not what we're talking about today. I don't think we've seen peaches anywhere in the How to Train Your Dragon series. The main meaning, which is relevant here, is one whose business it is to mend shoes. And I'm assuming that applies to boots as well. In other words, when Gobber volunteers to fix everybody's boots, Gobber becomes a cobbler. There is another meaning, which I didn't know before I looked this up, which is the last sheep to be sheared, which as far as I've read is in reference to it looking like sort of an old leather shoe. And judging by his attitude and size and general disposition, that might be applied to fungus. So, cobbler is the word of the day.
Time to answer all your hiccupy questions.
Okay, and this episode raises a few unanswered questions. The biggest of which, of course, is what's going to happen to Mildew and the dragons after the events of this episode. And that will get answered next week. Another question is, why don't the riders lose their boots? You notice it's only the adults in the village who have their boots stolen because it's only the adults who put their boots out. Why don't the riders put their boots out as well if it's boot night for everybody? And I have no idea. They go through all the trouble of animating the feet and toes of the other characters, I think for the first time, but not the riders, and I don't know why. Another question, I think this one's brought up in the wiki, is what about all the other dragons? We only see the dragon riders take their dragons off to Dragon Island. What about the rest? Because we've seen a lot of other dragons around Berk and a lot of other dragons that other people have as pets. What happened to them? Were they taken separately? Did they just fly off following Toothless? We don't know. It's never shown, probably for budgetary reasons. We see the weapons warehouse destroyed, which leaves them defenseless, and that's a big problem. All of that is understandable. But why then, if they need weapons for defense, is the huge surplus that Gobber has earlier in the series such a big problem? Couldn't those weapons have just been kept for defense purposes as well? And why, for that matter, does the lack of dragon fighting put Gobber out of a job if, in fact, he still needs to make weapons for defense? Maybe it's just that they don't need nearly as many or different kinds of weapons. Still, it's a continuity issue. Also, on a related note, why are all their weapons in a warehouse? Does nobody have any swords or anything in their houses? That will become more of a pointed question in the next episode, actually. The question I brought up earlier, why is Hiccup fixing the roof alone? Did he just tell his friends to stay away so he could look for the evidence by himself and thus not risk them screwing things up? Or are they just totally abandoning him even more than is shown? The first answer seems more likely, honestly. Though given how easily they give up in the rest of the episode, I can't rule out the second either. The Omershada commentators raise a couple of questions of their own. One is, why were they near Mildew's house in the first place? They know he hates dragons. Why didn't they just avoid his house, especially when they're doing this falling exercise? And maybe that's just foolishness on their part because they're still young or inexperienced. It is a good question, though. Another question they raise is, given that this is a society where there wasn't a lot of bathing and there would have been a lot of strong, unpleasant smells anyway, would they have cared about foot odor? I don't know. And I this podcast is long enough and is taking long enough to record, so I don't want to go on to more research trying to find out what the Viking opinion on foot odor was. It is still a unanswered question. And the final unanswered question is, what good does moving all the dragons to Dragon Island do, given that they can all fly? What's to stop them from flying back? And the only thing to stop them from flying back, as the Omershada guys point out, is their own obedience, their own sense of loyalty to their riders, which again only applies to a small subset of the dragons anyway. And maybe that's Stoic's thinking, that if he orders his son to take the dragons to Dragon Island and they stay there, well, Mildew thinks he has won. He can later make the argument, well, they stayed on this island, they were separated from their friends at a simple command, so they're clearly obedient, thus they're not going to be responsible for the kind of destruction we saw. On the other hand, if they fly back, well, then maybe it shows that Mildew was right. So maybe Stoic's gambling that the dragons are going to be obedient, or maybe this is just his testament.
Judging we shall go.
Okay, that actually brings us to the end. I've said all I have to say, which turns out is quite a bit. So my overall opinions is this is a good episode. I think it's actually quite a good plot. It's a simple, straightforward plot, but well executed, makes Mildew a more menacing villain, sets up the next episode very nicely, and is the first time really we see Hiccup lose or fail in any significant way. It also gives us more of a feel for how much the other riders care about their dragons, and a couple of great lines from the twins and Snotlout. I realize I haven't ever said what do I think makes a good DreamWorks Dragons episode. And for me, it's a few factors. The most important, is it a good story? Is it a compelling story that I'm curious about what happens, I get invested in, and makes me wonder what happens next, but is not too predictable? 2, does it have good comedy? This is a show and a franchise that relies a lot on humor, so does it do that well? Are the characters consistent with how they're portrayed earlier and how they're going to be portrayed later? In other words, is everybody acting in character? Finally, does it give us some insight or some development or just some fun moments or good moments of any kind with someone other than Hiccup and Toothless? As I've said several times, I think the greatest opportunity in a series like this is the opportunity to explore some of the other characters because we have the time and space to do it. So those are the factors. And we don't get a lot of insight into the other characters here. Well, I guess we do get more insight into Mildew and his very creepy past. I'll give it 4 out of 6 plasma blasts. And that's not so much a knock on this episode because it's not a 6, but because I know there's some really great ones coming later, and I want to save it for them.
Thank you for summing that up.
Thank you for your patience in waiting for this episode. I'm doing this just because I enjoy it. I'm not getting paid, not making any money for it, at least not yet. I also have an actual job I'm getting paid for. We just moved. We're unpacking our house. And all of this isn't to complain. It's just to explain that I've got a lot of other things going on. And so it's sometimes difficult to make time for this, though I really do enjoy it. And it also takes a lot of time to record and edit. I think I'm going to be starting with about 2 hours of recorded audio to edit down. That's probably going to take 7 or 8 hours to edit, and then there's the time watching the show. So overall, each episode of this podcast you're listening to is representative of about 10 to 12 hours of work on my part. I'm just trying to point out why it is that it takes so long for me to release each one, and I appreciate your patience. Our next episode is basically part 2 of the one we just finished. It's called Elven and the Outcasts, where we finally meet our next villain, Elven the Treacherous. Our theme music is Celtic Warrior by Damiano Baldoni, downloaded from freemusicarchive.org. The background image of a dragon is courtesy of Warpaint Cobra at freedigitalphotos.net. Thank you for listening. Until next time, I'm Smidvarg, and thanks for being part of the gang.